The dim glow of a street lamp flickered outside, casting long, eerie shadows across the small apartment. The air felt heavy, almost charged with something unseen. Deep in the corner of the room, perched on an old wooden chair, sat a doll. Not just any doll, Annabelle. With her cracked porcelain face, faded dress, and those lifeless, unblinking eyes, she looked like an innocent antique at first glance. But anyone who knew her story understood the dark secrets she carried. Annabelle wasn't just a toy. She wasn't something you'd find in a child's bedroom or on a collector's shelf. No, this doll was different. She was feared. She was locked away. And for good reason. Because those who crossed her path, those who dared to ignore the warnings, soon found themselves trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. It all started in the 1970s when a young nursing student named Donna received Annabelle as a gift from her mother. A simple, thoughtful gesture. Just a Raggedy Ann doll, nothing more. Or so it seemed. First, the doll was just that. A doll. It sat on Donna's bed, untouched, unmoving. But then, the small things started happening. Things easy to explain away. The doll shifting slightly. Its arms resting in different positions. Notes scribbled in childlike handwriting appearing out of nowhere. "Help me," they said. Donna and her roommate Angie brushed it off, assuming it was just their imaginations playing tricks on them. But then came the night when everything changed. One evening, Donna came home to find Annabelle in a completely different room. The doll wasn't just moved. It was kneeling as if it had placed itself there deliberately. But that wasn't the worst part. As she approached, she felt something. An overwhelming sense of dread, as if the air around her had turned ice cold. Something wasn't right. Then the blood appeared. Small drops smeared across Annabelle's hands, as if she had touched something or someone. But there was no source, no explanation. Fear gripped Donna and Angie. They knew this was no longer something they could ignore. They needed help. That's when they reached out to a medium, someone who could communicate with spirits. The answer they received was unsettling. According to the medium, the doll was inhabited by the spirit of a little girl named Annabelle Higgins, a child who had died tragically years ago. She was lonely, lost, and simply wanted love. Moved by the story, Donna decided to let Annabelle stay. But that decision would prove to be a terrible mistake. Not long after, things took a sinister turn. A close friend of Donna's, Lou, never liked the doll. He always felt uneasy around it, as if it was watching him, waiting for something. One night, Lou had a terrifying experience, one that he would never forget. He had been staying over when he awoke to a paralyzing fear. His body felt heavy, pinned down by an unseen force. And then he saw her, Annabelle. Not on the chair where she had been before, but standing at the foot of his bed, watching. Before he could move, before he could even scream, he felt a sharp pain across his chest, like invisible claws tearing through his skin. When the lights were turned on, deep scratches were found on his body, marks that burned, that should have taken days to heal, yet disappeared within hours. That was the final straw. Desperate, Donna turned to two paranormal investigators, the now famous Ed and Lorraine Warren. As soon as the Warrens stepped into the apartment, they knew Annabelle wasn't just a doll. And the spirit inside wasn't that of a lost little girl. No, it was something much darker. Something inhuman. The Warrens warned Donna that she had been deceived. The entity attached to the doll was seeking something. Control, attachment, perhaps even possession. Fearing what Annabelle could do next, the Warrens took the doll with them, locking her inside their occult museum, a place where the most haunted and cursed objects in the world were kept under strict protection. They sealed Annabelle inside a special glass case, blessed it, and warned everyone who visited, "Do not open under any circumstances." But did that stop Annabelle? Some say she's still active, that she moves even within her case, that visitors who mock her often regret it. One man, laughing at the doll, was later killed in a tragic motorcycle accident. Coincidence? Maybe. But those who believe in the supernatural think otherwise. And now, Annabelle remains locked away. But for how long? And is she truly trapped? Or just waiting? Because if history has taught us anything, it's that some spirits never rest. The glass case stood still, untouched, yet something about it felt alive. Inside, Annabelle sat motionless, her stitched smile unchanging, her faded eyes empty. But anyone who had spent time near her knew the truth. Stillness did not mean silence. Even locked away, she made her presence known. The Warrens had taken every precaution. The case was not just for display. It was a form of containment, reinforced with prayers and blessings meant to keep whatever dark force inhabited the doll from escaping. A small wooden plaque read, "Warning, positively do not open." But warnings didn't stop the curious, and curiosity often led to regret. There was one story that Lorraine Warren told with a haunted look in her eyes. A young couple had visited the museum, laughing off the idea that a doll could be dangerous. The man, cocky and fearless, knocked on the glass case, daring Annabelle to do something. He even taunted her, joking about the so-called curse. Lorraine had seen this happen before. People not taking the warnings seriously, treating the supernatural as a game. She tried to stop them, urging them to respect the objects in the room, but it was too late. As the couple drove away on their motorcycle, the laughter stopped. Just miles from the museum, something went horribly wrong. The bike swerved, crashed. The man didn't survive. His girlfriend, injured but alive, later told Lorraine through tears that just before the accident, they had both felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something unseen was with them. Coincidence? Or was it Annabelle's way of reminding the world that she wasn't just a story? Even years after being locked away, strange things continued to happen. Some visitors swore they saw the doll's head tilt ever so slightly when no one was looking. Others claimed to hear faint whispers near the case, though no one else seemed to be around. But perhaps the most unsettling incidents happened late at night when the museum was empty. Lorraine often spoke about how, on certain nights, the room where Annabelle was kept felt different. The air would turn thick, heavy with an unseen presence. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, shifting in ways that had no explanation. And sometimes, just before closing up for the night, she would hear something, a faint rustling, a soft tapping against the glass. But when she turned to look, Annabelle remained exactly where she had always been. Or had she? One morning, after a particularly restless night, Ed Warren entered the museum only to find something deeply disturbing. The case was still locked, but Annabelle was no longer sitting in her usual position. She had moved. Slightly but unmistakably. No one had been in the museum overnight. There was no logical explanation. And yet it kept happening. The Warrens weren't the only ones who experienced Annabelle's strange energy. A former caretaker of the museum, a skeptical man who had never been one to believe in hauntings, had a terrifying encounter he refused to talk about for years. One night, while doing his usual rounds, he felt an overwhelming urge to check on the doll. Something about the air in the room felt wrong. When he turned on the light, he saw it. Annabelle's head was tilted at a sharp angle, her hands placed differently than before. He stood frozen, his heart pounding. And then, in the silence of the room, a soft creak echoed from the wooden case, as if something had shifted inside. He left the museum that night and never returned. But what was it about Annabelle that made her different from other so-called haunted objects? Why was she feared, even by seasoned investigators who had spent decades dealing with the supernatural? Some believe that Annabelle wasn't just a doll with a spirit inside. She was a conduit, a vessel for something much darker. The entity attached to her wasn't merely lost or trapped. It was manipulative, patient, waiting for the right moment. It tricked Donna and her roommate into believing it was the spirit of a child. It used their kindness, their sympathy to gain trust. And once it had that, it showed its true nature. That's what made Annabelle so dangerous. She wasn't loud. She didn't move dramatically in front of people or cause objects to fly across the room. No, she worked subtly, gradually. A misplaced item here. A whisper there. A feeling of being watched. And then, when least expected, she struck, Through fear, through influence, through the slow, creeping realization that something was deeply, deeply wrong. Many have speculated that the entity inside Annabelle wants more than just to scare people. That it seeks to escape, to attach itself to someone new. And that's why the Warrens kept her locked away, never allowing her to be removed, never letting her fall into the wrong hands. But then came a night when something happened that shook even Lorraine Warren. A night when the museum's alarms went off, when the air itself seemed to crackle with something unseen. Because for the first time in years, the case was found. Slightly open. The air inside the museum was still, yet charged with something invisible, something heavy. Lorraine Warren stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. The case, Annabelle's case, was slightly ajar. Not wide open, not shattered, just enough for doubt to settle in, for the mind to race with questions that had no easy answers. No one had been in the museum overnight. The security system had been armed. There were no signs of a break-in, no disturbances anywhere else. Yet, here she was, staring at something that should have been impossible. Ed Warren, always the rational one, moved closer. His flashlight beamed steady as he inspected the case. The lock was still intact, the glass unbroken. And Annabelle. She hadn't moved. At least, not in any way they could see. Lorraine reached out, almost hesitantly, and closed the case, securing it tightly before whispering a quiet prayer under her breath. She had spent years dealing with the supernatural, witnessing things most people would never believe, but something about this, about Annabelle, felt different. The next morning, Ed reviewed the security footage, hoping for an explanation. The cameras had been positioned at every angle, recording non-stop. If someone had tampered with the case, it would be there, plain as day. But as he fast-forwarded through the night's footage, his fingers hovering over the pause button, his expression darkened. Nothing. The case hadn't moved. The glass remained shut. There was no moment, no flicker of motion, no shadow passing through the room. And yet, the case had been open. This wasn't the first time something unexplainable had happened around Annabelle, but it was the first time it had happened like this. Had the entity inside the doll grown stronger, more restless, or was it something else entirely? The museum had always been a place of containment, a safe space for cursed objects too dangerous to be left unchecked. Visitors came, but they were warned. Never touch, never taunt, never challenge what they didn't understand. Some listened, others didn't. One of those visitors had been a young woman named Rachel. She had always been drawn to the paranormal, fascinated by the unknown, but she never truly believed in it. To her, Annabelle was just a legend, a doll made infamous by stories and superstition. When she stood before the case, staring into Annabelle's blank, stitched smile, she felt nothing but amusement. "It's just a doll," she had said, snapping a photo on her phone. But as she turned to leave, she felt something, just for a second. A chill, a pressure in her chest, as if she had stepped into a room without air. She shook it off, convincing herself it was just nerves. That night, Rachel woke up gasping. Her room was dark, but something felt off. The air was thick, unmoving, and there was a weight on her chest, an unseen force pressing down. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. And then, just at the edge of her vision, she saw it, a shadow in the corner, unmoving but watching. The moment she blinked, it was gone. The next morning, she checked her phone, scrolling through the photos she had taken at the museum. When she reached the one of Annabelle, her heart stopped. The image was different. The doll's head was tilted slightly, her hands positioned differently than she remembered. And worse, there was something in the reflection of the glass, something behind her, something she knew hadn't been there. Rachel wasn't the first to experience something like this, and she wouldn't be the last. But what did Annabelle want? Some believed that the entity inside her fed on attention, on energy. That every whisper of her name, every story told about her, strengthened whatever force was bound to the doll. The Warrens had tried to contain her, to prevent her from reaching anyone else. But what if that wasn't enough? What if Annabelle wasn't waiting to be freed? What if she was already finding ways out? Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The museum was quiet, but Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She had spent years dealing with haunted objects, with spirits that lingered in the darkness, but Annabelle was different. There was something unsettling about her, something that felt aware. Ever since the night they had found the case slightly open, the energy in the museum had shifted. It wasn't obvious, not at first. Small things, unsettling dreams, the sensation of being watched, objects slightly out of place. But then the shadows started to feel heavier, darker, stretching in ways that didn't make sense. Ed dismissed it at first. "We've seen this before," he said, though even he couldn't ignore the way the atmosphere in the room seemed charged, like a storm was waiting to break. He had always been the logical one, the one who approached their cases with caution but without fear. But as the days passed, even Ed seemed uneasy. Then the knocking started. First it was faint, a single rhythmic tap echoing through the museum late at night, always near Annabelle's case. Lorraine tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was the old wooden floors settling. But deep down she knew better. One night, Ed set up cameras, determined to catch something, anything that could explain what was happening. He checked the footage each morning, fast-forwarding through hours of nothingness, only to find that the moments when the knocking occurred, the cameras would glitch. Just for a second. Just long enough to miss whatever had happened. And then there was the night that changed everything. Lorraine woke suddenly, her breath coming fast, her chest tight. Something was wrong. The house was too still. A deep, unnatural silence filled the air, pressing down on her like a weight. She reached for Ed, but he was already awake, sitting up beside her. His eyes locked on the bedroom door. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. They both felt it. Then the sound came again. 3 knocks. Not from the museum. Not from outside. From inside their home. Ed moved first, grabbing a flashlight as he stepped into the hallway. Lorraine followed, her pulse hammering in her ears. The house was dark, the air thick with something unseen. They moved carefully, slowly towards the museum door, knowing, without needing to say it, that the sound had come from there. Ed reached for the doorknob, hesitating just for a second before pushing it open. The museum was exactly as they had left it. Everything in its place. The cursed objects sat undisturbed, their cases locked, their warnings clear. And yet, something felt off. Lorraine turned to Annabelle's case, and her breath caught in her throat. The case was open. Not slightly. Fully. And Annabelle was gone. The room was silent, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Ed's grip tightened around the flashlight as he scanned the space. His voice low but firm. She didn't just move on her own. Lorraine barely heard him. Her eyes darted around the room, searching, her mind racing through every possibility. The security system hadn't been triggered. No one else was in the house. And yet Annabelle had moved. And then, in the corner of the room, something shifted. It was barely more than a flicker, a disturbance in the shadows. But they both saw it. A presence, unseen but there. Watching. Waiting. And then the lights flickered. And the knocking started again. But this time, it was coming from inside their house. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the house like someone was demanding to be let in. Ed and Lorraine stood frozen in the museum, the air thick with tension. The open case stood before them, empty. Annabelle was gone. But the knocking wasn't coming from the museum anymore. It was coming from down the hall. From inside their home. Ed turned first, his breath slow and measured, but Lorraine could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his grip on the flashlight had stiffened. They had spent years confronting the unexplained, but this was different. This wasn't just an investigation. This was happening here now, in their own home. Slowly they moved down the hallway. The knocking continued, steady, deliberate. 3 sharp raps against wood, then silence. It was coming from the spare room, a place rarely used but always kept locked. Lorraine felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine as Ed reached for the doorknob. He hesitated only for a second before turning it. The door creaked open. The room was dark, empty. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing out of place. And yet, the moment they stepped inside, the air shifted. It was colder here, unnaturally so, and the smell, faint but unmistakable, was that of old fabric, dust, something long forgotten. And then Lorraine saw it. In the corner of the room, slumped against the chair, was Annabelle. But something was wrong. The doll wasn't sitting the way she normally did. Her head was tilted too far, her arms spread unnaturally. And her eyes. Lorraine swore they looked different. Darker. Deeper. A sharp creak made them both turn. The closet door, which had been closed, was now slightly open. The space inside was black, impossibly black, as if it swallowed the light whole. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room dropped. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. Lorraine felt it deep in her chest, like something unseen was pressing against her ribs, making it harder to breathe. And then the whisper came. Right next to her ear. "She's not alone." Lorraine gasped, stepping back as the flashlight flickered wildly in Ed's hand. He swung the beam toward the closet, the shadows inside shifting unnaturally, stretching in ways that shouldn't be possible. And then, the door slammed shut. The entire house seemed to shake with the force of it. Lorraine stumbled, reaching for Ed as the knocking started again, this time from multiple places at once. The walls, the floor, the museum. The air filled with an energy so thick it made their skin prickle. Annabelle hadn't just moved. She had brought something with her. Something that was no longer confined to the case. The house felt like it was breathing. The walls groaned under an unseen pressure, the air thick with something Lorraine and Ed could not see, but could feel pressing down on them. The knocking had become a relentless, chaotic pounding, like dozens of unseen hands slamming against every surface at once. The temperature had dropped even more, their breath visible in the dim light of the flashlight. Annabelle sat in the chair, unmoving, yet somehow still watching. Lorraine's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the doll's empty eyes. The whisper she had heard moments ago echoed in her mind. "She's not alone." Whatever had been attached to Annabelle before was no longer just contained within her. It had spread. Ed tightened his grip on the crucifix in his hand. His voice steady but firm. "We're not alone in this house, Lorraine," he said, stepping closer to Annabelle. "And whatever's here, it's growing stronger." The words had barely left his lips when the lights in the entire house blew out. The flashlight flickered, then died, plunging them into absolute darkness. And then, a sound neither of them would ever forget. A deep guttural breath. It wasn't theirs. Lorraine clutched Ed's arm as an invisible force swept through the room, knocking over books, rattling picture frames, making the very foundation of their home tremble. She knew this feeling. It was something ancient, something feeding off their fear, something waiting. Annabelle was only the beginning. Didn't hesitate. He grabbed a vial of holy water from his pocket and began to recite a prayer, his voice unwavering despite the suffocating presence surrounding them. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this house." His voice cut through the air like a blade, but the presence only grew heavier, denser. And then Lorraine saw it. Just for a split second. A shape in the darkness, standing behind Annabelle's chair. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. Figure. Butching. Lorraine's breath caught as its head twitched unnaturally, its limbs jerking like a puppet with broken strings. The figure didn't move closer, but the pressure in the room grew unbearable, like something was pressing against their very souls. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The walls went silent. The air cleared. The room settled into an eerie stillness. And Annabelle was back in her case. The glass was shut. The lock was sealed. It was as if she had never moved at all. Ed and Lorraine exchanged a look, their hearts still hammering, their breaths unsteady. Lorraine knew what Ed was thinking because she was thinking it too. This wasn't over. Whatever had been inside their house, whatever had moved Annabelle, had left for now. But it wasn't gone. And then, just as they turned to leave, a single soft sound broke the silence. Tap. Against the glass. Annabelle's case. Something had been watching. And it wanted them to know. It wasn't finished yet. Ed and Lorraine stood frozen, their eyes locked on the glass case. The tap against it had been faint, almost delicate, but it was enough. Enough to remind them that whatever they had just experienced, whatever force had moved Annabelle and filled their home with an oppressive, suffocating presence, had not simply vanished. Had retreated, waiting, watching. Lorraine exhaled slowly, gripping Ed's arm as if grounding herself back to reality. The air had cleared, the energy in the room no longer felt crushing, but something still lingered. A residue of whatever had been there remained, hanging in the silence like a whisper left unsaid. Ed ran a hand through his hair, his breathing finally steadying. "We need to reinforce the case," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And we need to bless the entire house. Tonight." Neither of them would be sleeping. The rest of the night was spent in prayer, in cleansing, in doing everything they had learned in their years of experience to ensure that whatever had stepped into their home would not take root there. They sprinkled holy water in every room, sealed Annabelle's case with fresh protective blessings, and reinforced the museum with prayers of protection. Yet despite all of it, despite every precaution, Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Annabelle had always been dangerous. But now it felt like the doll wasn't just an object holding a spirit, it was a beacon, door. And that door had been opened, if only for a moment. Days passed, and though the house returned to normal, no more knocking, no more flickering lights, no more unexplainable shadows, the unease never fully left. It was subtle, buried beneath routine, but it was there. Lorraine would catch herself pausing outside the museum, listening for something she couldn't quite name. Ed would glance toward Annabelle's case more often than before, as if expecting it to be open again. One afternoon, a close friend of the Warrens, Father Thomas, visited the museum to conduct an additional blessing. He was no stranger to their work, no stranger to the artifacts they kept locked away. As he moved through the museum, his prayers filling the space with a calm, steady energy, he paused in front of Annabelle. His expression was unreadable, his hand tightening slightly on the rosary he carried. "She's different now," he murmured after a long moment. Lorraine's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Father Thomas studied the doll, the dim light casting long shadows across the glass case. "The spirit inside. It feels like it's no longer alone." The words sent a chill through the room. Ed and Lorraine exchanged a glance. They had suspected it, felt it, and now, hearing it confirmed by someone else only made it worse. "What can we do?" asked. Father Thomas sighed, his fingers brushing over the cross around his neck. "You've done everything right. The case is sealed. The prayers are strong. But whatever came through that night, it made a connection. It may not be here now, but it knows this place. It knows you." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. The Warrens had faced many entities, many forces beyond human understanding, but this was different. This wasn't just about Annabelle anymore. That night, as Lorraine prepared for bed, she lingered by the museum door longer than usual. Ed was already inside, double-checking the locks, making sure everything was as secure as it could be. She watched him through the glass, his silhouette moving past the dimly lit cases of cursed objects. Then something caught her eye. A reflection in the museum glass. Nutted. Something else. She turned quickly, her heart hammering, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. The house was silent. She let out a shaky breath, whispering a prayer under her breath as she stepped away. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. Or maybe something was still watching. The weeks passed, and though nothing happened, no unexplained noises, no strange occurrences, the feeling never fully left. It was like a presence just beyond the edge of perception, waiting, unseen but never truly gone. And then, one evening, as Ed locked up the museum for the night, Lorraine heard something that made her blood run cold. Single soft knock. From inside the glass case. She turned, heart pounding, her eyes landing on Annabelle. The doll sat exactly where she always had, her head tilted slightly, her stitched smile unchanging. The case was locked, sealed. And yet, Lorraine took a slow step back, her fingers pressing against the cross around her neck. She whispered Ed's name, her voice barely above a breath. He turned, following her gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ed reached out, running his hand along the glass of Annabelle's case, as if testing the barrier between them. His reflection stared back at him, distorted slightly by the dim light. He exhaled, shaking his head. "It's over, Lorraine," he murmured, though even he didn't sound fully convinced. "She's locked away, where she belongs." Lorraine nodded slowly, but her gut told her otherwise. Annabelle was back in her case. But the thing that had come through with her, that was still out there, waiting.